That meant he hadn't really needed rescuing in the first place. When he had assured her he would be fine, he had been telling the truth. She had followed him onto this darn ship because she had been worried about him, but he hadn't needed the ship either. Her anger was supplanted for a moment by confusion. Why didn't you just fly away when we were in the smuggler's port? Hara frowned as she asked the question. Maybe it was better to change the subject anyway, as she wasn't comfortable with her own anger. He motioned to the ivory bracelets, which were lying on the wooden boards by the wheel. They stopped me. That's why I got you to take them off. I think we should put them away, don't you? Gideon stepped past her and collected up the bracelets. Hara followed him, stunned by his revelation. What's a dragon doing here? She asked. I mean in a smuggler's port. You were being kept prisoner by a couple of Roshbarkers. Gideon tucked the bracelets away in one of his pockets and nodded, as if that answered the question. He was so frustrating. He was looking out the window to the side. Probably checking out the damage the ship had taken. The engine still whined. She went to the tube and cooled down. Henry, let the engines idle. We don't need the power and I don't want to blow it. Aye, Captain, Henry replied automatically. Hara turned back to the dragon. Gideon said, it might be difficult to get anywhere with the damage. I'm sorry it took me so long, but I needed to get some distance away from the bands. Hara shook her head. He was a dragon. She could hardly get her head around the fact that there was a dragon in front of her. Dragons had once eaten humans and burned them to crisps. But a few hundred years ago, they made a treaty with humans. Now the nobility were mostly half-dragon, half-human hybrids. The dragons could have taken over the government if they had wanted to, but they did not crave power in the same way that humans did. They usually collected things. Money, treasure, and even humans. Slavery was outlawed, but dragons did not consider the humans in their collections to be slaves. They also never took things from people who looked after them. Hara thought that was the main reason they hadn't seized power from humans. They must have approved of whatever the governments were doing to look after their people and lands. Hara worried one day that attitude might change if humans ever took advantage of the people under their care. No one had ever explained to her why it was different if you were owned by a dragon, because she had never met a dragon before and would probably have gone her whole life without meeting one if she hadn't stumbled upon Gideon. Most commoners never met a dragon in their lifetime. She had hoped to be so blessed. Unfortunately, she had never been very lucky, and recently luck had not been her friend. Hara said, "So what's stopping you from flying away now?" Gideon glanced at her as if amazed by the suggestion. He looked over his shoulder out to the side stabilizers. "I think I'll stick around a little longer. You might need me." She went to the window to assess the damage. The stabilizer was there, but it was flapping in the wind. If they didn't secure it soon, it would snap off and they would have to replace the whole thing. Hara asked, "Can you make sure we don't lose bits of the ship?" Gideon grinned at her. "I knew you wouldn't mind that I was a dragon." Hara wrinkled her nose. "You're useful. We'll discuss your being a dragon later." She turned when Henry came onto the bridge. "Man, that was close." Hara had to agree with him. "And bad luck. We're badly damaged." Henry asked, "The place we're going to, does it have the facilities to fix this kind of damage?" Hara looked out the window again at the stabilizers. "My Opa is an engineer. He'll fix this in a jiffy. If I had the tools, I could have fixed it myself. His place isn't very far from here, it was where we were headed, anyway. It's more than time I visited my hometown. After that, you two can go anywhere you like. Preferably back to your homes." Henry ran a hand through his hair. "That might be difficult for me. You see, the Empire, and well, most countries don't look so kindly on people who work on pirate ships. Hara frowned at him. But you were taken. You're a victim. Surely they can't blame you. Gideon spoke up. They all say he should have died. Hara snorted. There were always options when you were alive. But she saw the point. Regardless of whether or not Henry had been forced, he would be considered guilty. Gideon stepped closer to her. I also don't really want to go back home. You see, I was minding my own business when some people kidnapped me. I think floating around all over the place will make me just a tad more difficult to kidnap. She turned to glare at him. She was going to say he was a dragon and could look after himself perfectly well, but she noticed Henry was listening intently. She decided it might be better to keep Gideon's identity a secret for the time being. She flapped a hand at him and he just flashed her a grin. She said firmly, like you would to a puppy when training him, you might be safer at home. His grin only grew broader. The insufferable lout. But he had saved her life, so she would tolerate him for a little longer. She would need all her attention focused on their destination, anyway. Hara hadn't been home in years. Her father had destroyed her faith in family. She had walked away from him and his schemes. At first she had intended to go back, but she knew that her Opa's home was no longer her own. So she had taken the long way home, and that had been 2 years ago. She wasn't looking forward to this homecoming. Gideon held onto the side of the blazing blunderbuss. The ship tipped with his extra mass as he made sure the stabilizing sails on the side of the ship weren't going anywhere. He let go of the airship and dropped back, snapping his wings open at the last moment. He spun and grazed the ground with a claw before he moved his wings and pulled himself up. He flew a few laps around the airship before bringing himself to the deck. He changed back into his human form. Henry came past and he looked up from some food stores in his hands. He frowned. What are you doing out here? Gideon grinned. Just getting some air. Henry nodded and turned his attention back to the food. I hope you like kokorvin. Man, I miss cooking. Henry was gone before Gideon could give an answer either way. He seemed like an easygoing fellow and Gideon wondered if Hara realized she had already added the man to her collection. Gideon sauntered onto the bridge. Hara had her head bowed as she worked on something. He watched her for a long moment. Her hands were delicate and moved like a witch casting an incantation. He asked, "What are you making?" Hara didn't look up as she answered. I'm putting in a mount so I can put a chair up here for you to sit on. At the very least, it should give you something to hold on to if we ever have to move suddenly. She looked up at him and asked, You secure the sails? He nodded. They'll be fine until we can get into a port. Hara thanked him and went back to her work. She didn't notice when he continued to watch her. It was kind of her to put in the chair for him. He wondered if she realized she wore her emotions on her sleeve. After a while, he went to explore the rest of the ship. There were a few small rooms and a large stateroom. He was tempted to move into it and see what Hara did about it, but he knew he would have to work slowly with her. She reminded him of a deer. A little skittish. He finally settled himself in one of the cleanest rooms and laid down to sleep. He felt comfortable on the ship, a bit like how he felt when he was working on a theorem with other mathematicians. That moment when everything clicked together and the part he had played in it all, amazing, he could feel that without having to do anything. He fell asleep with a smile on his lips. Chapter 4. The blazing blunderbuss limped into the outskirts of the small town near sunset. Hara yelled for Gideon to drop anchor well outside the town center. There was no one to set the anchor, so they let it drag on the ground until it dug in. The whole ship jerked and shuddered before it settled. Henry called up from the engine room. She's all put to bed, Captain.